Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyid al-Mursaleen. Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. I bear witness that no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah Ta'ala, the one who has no partner and no similar, the one who has no length and no width and no depth and no perimeter, the one who is not a volume and is not in a place. And how could he be in a place when he existed before time and space? He's not in the direction of up, down, right, left, front, nor back. And whatever you imagine in your mind, Allah is different than that. And I bear witness that our noble, unrivaled master, Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the slave of Allah, his final messenger, and the best of all of God's creations. May Allah unite us with him in paradise and grant us a drink from his basin. And as always, I ask Allah to grant myself and to grant all of you sincere intentions. Ameen. When last we met, we were in the book, the 7 Hadeeth, obligatory knowledge that every Muslim must know. And we had made it to page 17, the top of page 17, where we had just finished discussing how you know when each prayer time begins and ends. And we're about to enter into a section that deals with Salat preventers. Now, this is a section that requires some concentration. It's not that it's hard to understand. This section is actually not difficult to understand, but it's that you have two different subjects that are kind of similar to one another, and it's easy to get the two of them mixed up. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a head start right now that the first thing we're going to talk about is the rulings associated with the beginning of a salat preventer. And then after we talk about that, we're going to talk about the rulings associated with the end of a salat preventer. The rules for the beginning and the rules for the end are not the same, and they're independent of one another. Okay, so I'm telling you now that there's going to come a time when you have to put the two sets of rules together without mixing them up. Inshallah, we'll cover all of this today and maybe even a little bit more. So let's go right into it. Page 17, at the top of the page, it says, without an excuse, it is unlawful to perform these prayers before their times have set in, or to delay them until their times have passed. Okay, so this is a basic rule about the times of the salats, the times which we talked about last week. Okay, each salat has a time, and before that time, the salat is not valid. Why is that? It's because we're discussing right now the 8 conditions for the validity of a salat. So if the condition is not met, the salat will not be valid. One of the 8 conditions is that the time for the salat has already come in. So if you try to pray a salat before its time comes in, then the condition has not been met, and it means that salat is not going to be valid. So if a person tries to pray dhuhr 10 minutes before dhuhr time, that dhuhr salat will not count. Okay? And if a person prays dhuhr 10 minutes after dhuhr time ends, then this case, just like the case I just mentioned, is also a case where the person has committed an enormous sin for not praying within the time. So it's your obligation to perform the salat within the time, somewhere between when the prayer time starts and when the prayer time ends. This is the window that you have for performing a salat. If you pray it early, that's an enormous sin. If you pray it after the time goes out, that's also an enormous sin. You know, when I was first learning all of this, my teacher, may Allah preserve him, he asked me a very simple question. He said, which one do you think is worse? You know, to pray before the time comes in or to pray after the time goes out? Now, at that time, I was a new Muslim. I didn't know anything. And I probably was still thinking the way, this Christian American society had taught me. So I said, well, it's the one which is probably the better situation would be to pray early. Because, in American society, they teach us that being late is shameful and that being early is virtuous. So I guessed that it's better to pray early than it is to pray late. And he told me, no, actually, it's better to pray late than it is to pray early. Although both cases are haram and an enormous sin, to do either of those without a religiously valid excuse. But the reason why it's better to pray late than to pray early is because if you pray late, yes, you've committed the enormous sin of not praying within the time. But if you pray late, it counts as you making up the prayer that you missed. So that salat will count. It'll count as a makeup, but it will still count. Whereas if you pray early, that salat simply doesn't count as anything. Like, it doesn't fulfill your obligation to pray within the time. And since the time came in and went out without you praying, it doesn't count as a makeup prayer either. So if you pray early, then that means you simply left out the salat. And on the day of judgment, you're going to be questioned about why you did not perform it. Whereas if you prayed it late, at least you'll be able to say on the day of judgment that you did perform it. It was late, but you did it. Okay, so praying late is a better situation than praying early, although both of them are enormous sins. Enormous sins. And without a religiously valid excuse, it is an enormous sin to pray a salat before its time or to delay it until after its time is over. Just for your own curiosity, there are certain things which count as religiously valid excuses for praying a salat before its time or after its time. The most well-known example is that if a person is traveling a far distance, and some other conditions are also met as well, then the person would be allowed to pray Asr in Dhuhr time, for example. Okay, that would be an example of praying Asr before its time for a religiously valid excuse. You could also conversely pray Dhuhr during Asr time while traveling. This would be a religiously valid excuse for praying Dhuhr after its time went out. Okay, this is what we mean by a religiously valid excuse. Okay, and just like how Dhuhr and Asr are kind of like, sibling salats, each can be prayed in the other's time with a religiously valid excuse. It's also the case that Maghrib and Isha can each be prayed in the other's time as long as you have a religiously valid excuse. So I'll say that again. Dhuhr and Asr can be paired. They can be joined. They can be combined. Okay, you can pray them both in Dhuhr time or you can pray them both in Asr time. Which salats are we talking about? Dhuhr and Asr. They can be combined together. Also, Maghrib and Isha can be combined together, meaning you can pray both of those salats in Maghrib time, or you can pray both of them in Isha time. Maghrib and Isha are combinable, okay? But Asr and Maghrib are not combinable. Asr and Maghrib cannot be combined. Isha and Fajr cannot be combined. Fajr and Dhuhr cannot be combined. Okay, the only combinable salats are Dhuhr with Asr and Maghrib with Isha. And even then, it can only be done for a religiously valid excuse. Okay. MashaAllah. There's a lot of talking for one sentence. So now we're going to talk about the salat preventer. What do I mean? First off, what is a salat preventer? When we talk about a salat preventer, we mean that something happens which makes it impossible for the person to make a valid salat. Okay, we don't mean that it makes it difficult or that something happens like that breaks the wudu, so he can't make salat in his current state, but really he could make a salat if he just went and made wudu first. That's not what we're talking about. A salat preventer is something that the person truly cannot make a salat in that state. An example would be like if the woman begins her menstrual bleeding. This is a salat preventer. Okay, it's not possible for her to perform a valid salat until her menstrual bleeding ends. Okay, while she's bleeding, while she's on her period, she cannot make a valid salat. Menstrual bleeding falls into this category. Postpartum bleeding falls into this category. Insanity falls into this category. Yes, insanity. So brothers out there, don't think that this part of the lesson is something only women need to hear because it's about blood. No. Any kind of salat preventer falls under these rules which we're about to mention, and insanity is one such salat preventer. If a person is insane, it is not possible for that person to perform a valid salat. It says, if a salat preventer, such as menses, occurs after a prayer time has set in, then that salat remains an obligation upon him or her if, and only if, there was enough time to perform the salat before the preventer occurred. Okay, this is a rule. I'm going to say it again. If prayer time sets in and enough time passed that the person could have performed a salat in that time, and then after that point, a salat preventer occurred, then we say he's responsible for performing that salat. If he did not actually pray it in that window, which was a big enough window for him to pray it, if he did not actually pray it in that window, then he still must pray that salat. Okay, meaning once the preventer goes away, he's going to have to pray the salat that he did not pray when he had the opportunity to pray it. That's the situation we're talking about now. And I will remind you that each salat has a wide time. Dhuhr has, hours, a window that's hours long. You don't have an obligation to pray as soon as the salat time comes in. Okay, if Dhuhr time comes in, say at 12 o'clock, if I'm in the middle of doing something, I don't have to pray as soon as it comes in at 12 o'clock. I can say, well, let me finish this. I'll pray at 12:45. It's not haram for me to do that. Okay, it's not haram for me to choose to pray at 12:45. But what happens if Dhuhr time came in at 12 o'clock? I decided I'm going to pray it later, maybe 12:45. But then, at 12:30, I go crazy. I lose my mind. I didn't perform Dhuhr. And now I'm insane. Now I'm not able to perform a salat. What's the rule here? Well, the rule is the rule I just mentioned. If there was enough time between the onset of the salat time and the onset of the salat preventer, if there was enough time between those 2 points that I could have prayed the salat in that time, then that means I must pray that salat. So if I didn't pray it before I went insane, then I'm going to have to pray it after I regain my sanity. That's the rule. Now, when I say that there's enough time to perform the salat, what I mean is if you did a bare bones minimal salat, like if you prayed it as fast as you possibly could, is there enough time that you could have done that? That's what I'm talking about. So Dhuhr, for example, let's just say that it's a 4 rak'ah salat. So let's say if a person prayed it fast, they could finish it in 4 minutes. Let's just say that for now, that the quickest you can pray a salat if you hurry is equal to the number of rak'ahs. A 4 rak'ah salat takes you 4 minutes if you hurry. A 3 rak'ah salat takes you 3 minutes if you hurry. Okay, let's just use that as an assumption for my explanation. Some people might be able to pray faster than that. Some people, such as myself, probably can't finish it that fast. But this is the scenario. This is the scenario. So the rule is, if there was enough time between the onset of the Salat time and the onset of the Salat preventer, if there was enough time for the person to perform a minimal, quick version of that Salat in that small window, then the person is required to perform the Salat. That's the rule. Let's give an example. Let's say Dhuhr time begins at 12 noon. And since it's a 4 rak'ah Salat, let's say it takes a person 4 minutes to do it if they rush. Let's say that 12 noon arrived, Dhuhr time came in, the person chose not to pray right away. The person decided he's going to pray at 1 o'clock, but this woman's menstrual bleeding began at 12:30. 1 o'clock didn't arrive before her bleeding started, so she did not get the chance to pray her Dhuhr Salat. In this case, we say, first off, that this is not haram. She did not do anything sinful by deciding to delay her Dhuhr 1 hour and pray it at 1 o'clock, which is still within Dhuhr time. This is not sinful for her. Okay? She did not know that she was going to start bleeding right at that time, but the bleeding began. And now she can't pray her Dhuhr Salat. The rule says, because it only takes her 4 minutes to pray Dhuhr, and she had a full 30 minutes before her bleeding started, we say, therefore, that after her menses is over and after she has made her ghusl, she is going to have to pray that Dhuhr Salat, which she had a chance to do. She had the opportunity. If she had been on top of her deen, she would have prayed as soon as the time came in and she would have finished that Salat. So because she had an opportunity to pray that Salat, she must make it up after her bleeding ends and she makes her ghusl. That's the rule. Let's give another example. Let's say that Asr time begins at 3 o'clock. And since it's a 4 rak'ah Salat, let's say it takes a person 4 minutes to pray. So let's say when 3 o'clock arrives and it's now Asr time, the person decides, I'm not going to pray Asr. The person says, I'm going to pray Asr later, like 4 o'clock, not 3 o'clock. But then at 3:05, this man goes crazy. And he stays crazy for 10 days. Okay, at 3:05, he goes crazy. The question we need to ask ourselves is, did he have enough time to perform the Asr prayer before he went crazy? Is Asr started at 3 o'clock? He went crazy at 3:05. The question is, were those 5 minutes a long enough period of time that he could have completed an Asr prayer in that time? Well, the answer in this case is yes, because we said that particular person would only need 4 minutes to pray Asr. So yeah, it means that this man, when his insanity goes away and he returns to sanity, he's going to have to pray the Asr prayer that he didn't get a chance, or rather that he had a chance to pray, but he didn't pray at the very beginning of the time. He's going to have to make it up. Inshallah, this should be clear. Inshallah ta'ala. Nonetheless, I'll give another example. Let's say Isha time starts at 8 p.m. Isha is 4 rak'ahs long. That means the fastest a person could pray it in this example is 4 minutes. Let's say Isha starts at 8 p.m. And at 8:01 p.m., the person goes crazy. When this person's insanity finishes, when the person returns to sanity, is he going to have to pray that Isha Salat? The answer is no. The answer is what? No. Because the 1 minute that elapsed in Isha time before he went crazy was not a long enough period for him to actually perform a complete Isha Salat. Even if he rushed, he would not have been able to finish in that time. So the ruling of the Sharia in this case is that he's not responsible for performing that Salat. When he returns to sanity, he will not have to make it up. I'm going to share my screen here. Inshallah, you'll be able to see some a rough sketch of what a day might look like with Fajr time and then Duha time. Some of you maybe have never heard of that Salat. It's not one of the obligatory Salats, so people don't always know about it. But Fajr time, and then Duha time, and then Dhuhr time, and then Asr time, and then Maghrib time, and then Isha time. These are going to be my markers for when a Salat preventer begins and when it ends. So let's say that a person's Salat, let's say that a person had a Salat preventer begin, very close to Dhuhr time, say like 2 minutes after Dhuhr time came in. Let's say the person went insane, and the person stayed insane until Maghrib time. Okay, here is where it ended, the long part of the triangle. The long part of the triangle is when it started. The long part of the triangle is when it ended. We would say that this person, because his insanity started only 2 minutes after Dhuhr, we would say he does not have to make up that Dhuhr Salat. As for the rules that apply when his insanity ends, we haven't talked about those yet. For now, let's just worry about the beginning part. Inshallah, this is clear. So let's read what's in the book again, and inshallah, it'll be understood. It says, if a Salat preventer, such as menses, occurs after a prayer time has set in, then that Salat remains an obligation upon him if there was enough time to perform the Salat before the preventer occurred. Next sentence. And also purification in cases where purification must be done after the time sets in. Okay, so that's actually the same sentence. And also purification in cases where purification must be done after the time sets in. So this is a wrinkle in the rule. Okay, this is a wrinkle in the rule, at least as the rule is expressed here. There are certain cases where a person cannot perform purification before the time comes in. Most Muslims, they have to make wudu before they can make salat. And if they want, they can make the wudu before the salat time, right? I can make wudu before dhuhr. And then when dhuhr time comes, I can pray dhuhr. There's no rule that says I have to make salat within dhuhr time. That's why in the examples I gave already, I did not ask about whether you had enough time to perform wudu. I only asked, did you have enough time to perform the salat? But there are certain cases where you cannot perform your purification before the salat time enters. We've already talked about one of those examples earlier in the book, and that's the case of tayammum. We mentioned that tayammum cannot be done until after the prayer time has set in. So if you're in a situation where you need to make tayammum, then know that you cannot make tayammum until after the time comes in. And so that means that, let's say it takes a person 10 minutes to do tayammum because, you have to look for water and other things. Let's say it takes a person 10 minutes to make tayammum plus 4 minutes to pray dhuhr. So in that situation, we would say that if his insanity started 14 minutes after dhuhr time set in, or longer than that, but 14 minutes or more after dhuhr time started, then we would say he has to make up that dhuhr salat. But if he didn't have the full 14 minutes that he needs to do his purification as well as the salat, then he would not have to make up the salat. This comes in cases where you cannot do the purification beforehand. Tayammum is one such case. Incontinence is another such case. Incontinence is like a person who drips. The urine drips from their body throughout the day. So if a person drips so much that they cannot perform a salat without a drop of urine coming out in the middle of the salat, this person is said to have incontinence. And there are special rules for these people. Among those rules are that they cannot perform wudu until after the time comes in. In fact, they have a whole set of purification things they need to do between when the salat time begins and when they make their salat. So all of the time required to do all of that is taken into account for those people. So we don't just ask, was there enough time to make the salat? For those people, we ask, was there enough time to do your purification as well as the salat? Why is there a difference for them? Because for those people, the purification also cannot be done until the salat time comes in. So just like how the salat cannot be done until the time comes in, their purification cannot be done until time comes in. So both of them need to be taken into account. Whereas for normal people, the purification can come beforehand, and that's why it is not taken into account. Inshallah, that's clear. All right, let's go to the next part. Again, I want to be very clear. Everything we talked about so far, we talked about in the context of what? When a salat preventer begins. And the question that we asked was, did you have enough time between the start of the salat time and the start of the salat preventer to make the salat? That's the question. Now we're going to switch subjects. We're going to talk now about the rules for when your salat preventer ends. And the rule is very different when the salat preventer ends. Okay, so let's read it. It says, on the other hand, if a salat preventer ends during a salat time, then if there was enough time to say Allahu Akbar before the time expired, that salat is an obligation upon him or her, as well as the salat before it, if that salat is combinable with it. I'm going to read it again. On the other hand, if a salat preventer ends during a salat time, then if there was enough time to say Allahu Akbar before the time expired, that salat is an obligation upon him, as well as the salat before it, if that salat is combinable with it. So the rule for when your preventer ends, when your menstrual bleeding ends, when your postpartum bleeding ends, when your insanity ends, the rule for when it ends, we do not ask, could you perform a whole salat? No, that's not what we ask when it ends. We ask, did you have enough time to say Allahu Akbar before the salat time was over? That's what we ask. And then the next question we ask is that salat combinable with the salat before it? Because if it is, then you have to make that salat up too. That's the rules for the end of the salat preventer. Let's keep reading. It says, so if one's insanity, for example, ended with enough time to say Allahu Akbar before sunset, then he must pray Asr and Dhuhr. If it ended with enough time to say Allahu Akbar before true dawn, then both Isha and Maghrib must be performed. Okay, so what we're talking about here is now we're talking about the end of the salat. So the examples in the book are, let's say someone's insanity ended right before Maghrib time. We're talking like seconds before Maghrib time started. So it's still Asr time because Maghrib's not in yet. It's Asr time. And we're not asking, did he have enough time to make a whole salat? We're saying, did he have enough time just to say Allahu Akbar before the sun set? If the answer is yes, then this person is going to have to pray that Asr Salat because he had enough time to say Allahu Akbar. And on top of that, he's also going to have to pray Dhuhr. Why will he have to pray Dhuhr? Because Asr time is also Dhuhr time when a person has a religious excuse. Okay, because of this person's Salat preventer, he has an excuse. And that excuse is going to make Dhuhr also an obligation upon him. Okay, he's going to have to pray Dhuhr and Asr because they're combinable. So they can both be prayed during Asr time. And the fact that he could say Allahu Akbar during Asr time means both of those Salats are confirmed for him. But what if his insanity had ended in the middle of Maghrib time? Does he have enough time to say Allahu Akbar before Isha begins? Yes, he does. It's the middle of Maghrib, so he has enough time to say Allahu Akbar. If that's when his insanity ended, we would say, does he have enough time to say Allahu Akbar before the end of Maghrib time? Yes, so he must make up his Maghrib Salat. The second question we would ask is the Salat before it, which Salat is before Maghrib? Asr. Is the Salat before it combinable with it? Can you combine Asr and Maghrib together? The answer is no, you cannot. So therefore, he has to make up Maghrib, and he does not have to make up Asr, because Asr and Maghrib are not combinable. Okay? That's how the rule works. That's how the rule works. What if the person's Salat preventer, like say the woman's menses, ended in the middle of Isha time? Which Salats would she have to make up? Well, because she has enough time to say Allahu Akbar before the end of Isha, she will have to pray Isha. And she will also have to pray Maghrib because Maghrib is combinable with Isha. What if her menstruation ended during Fajr time? Well, the question is, does she have enough time to say Allahu Akbar before Fajr ended? If the answer is yes, then she has to pray Fajr. The next question we ask, is the Salat before Fajr combinable with it? The answer is no. Isha cannot be combined with Fajr. So in that case, the only Salat she would make up is Fajr. What if the man's insanity ended during Duha time? What's the rule? Well, Duha is not one of the obligatory Salats, so he would not have to make up anything if his insanity ends during Duha time. Inshallah, this is all very clear. Okay. Now the fun part. I'm going to ask a number of situations, cases. I want all of you to think in your mind about what the answer of these cases will be. Okay? And inshallah, what you think in your mind is the right answer. I've never done this online before. Normally I have students in front of me so I can, smile at them when they call out wrong answers. Now I'm going to have to just imagine that all of you are getting everything right, mashallah. Okay. Let's say a man went insane, starting in the middle of Dhuhr time, and his insanity lasted until the middle of Isha time. All right? This vertical part of the line of the triangle, that's when it started. This vertical part here is when it ended. That's the time that he was insane for. Which Salats will he be responsible for? Let's talk through the process. First, concerning when his insanity began, we need to ask ourselves, was there enough time between the beginning of Dhuhr and the beginning of his insanity for him to complete the Dhuhr prayer, even if he did it in a minimal and fast way. In this case, yes, this is like the middle of Dhuhr time. For sure, there was 4 minutes in that gap. So he's going to have to make up his Dhuhr Salat. As for when his insanity ended, the question that we ask here is there enough time in Isha for him to say Allahu Akbar? The answer is yes. Therefore, he's going to have to pray Isha. And the question we ask after that, is the Salat before Isha combinable with it? The answer is yes. So he's also going to have to pray that. So in this example of the person who was insane from this time until this time, we would say that person is responsible for praying Dhuhr, Maghrib, and Isha. This person will not have to pray Asr. Okay, this person would pray Dhuhr, Maghrib, and Isha. This person would not have to pray Asr. Let's do a different example. Let's say a woman's period began during the morning hours, after Fajr time is over and before Dhuhr, during the Duha time. That's when her period began. And let's just say that, a week later, her period ended during Maghrib time, very close to the end of Maghrib time. So there's 2 minutes only left in Maghrib time. Only 2 minutes left. Which salats will she have to pray now that her bleeding is over? Well, let's think through the process. Did her bleeding begin during a prayer time? No, it did not. So she's not going to have to make up anything as far as concerning the start of her bleeding. But the end of her bleeding was during a prayer time. So we're going to ask ourselves, was there enough time for her to say Allahu Akbar before the end of Maghrib time? Yes. We said there was still 2 minutes left in Maghrib time. That's more than enough time to say Allahu Akbar. So she's going to have to pray Maghrib. And the next question is the Salat before Maghrib combinable with Maghrib? The answer is no. So in this example, this woman, now that her menses is over, she's going to have to make ghusl and she's going to have to pray Maghrib. That's it. I hope all of you are listening along and thinking in your own mind what the answers are. Because every single time I've ever had a student learn this for the first time, they always mix together the beginning cases and the ending cases. Okay, I'm trying my best here for you to keep them separate in your minds. Let's do another example, just to make sure everyone understands. Let's say her period began in the middle of Fajr time, and she didn't pray Fajr. And then a week later, her period ended in the middle of Fajr time. What salat is she going to have to make up? In this example, she will have to pray 2 Fajrs. In this example, she will have to pray 2 Fajrs. Why? Because when her bleeding started, there had been enough time had passed in Fajr that she could have prayed the Fajr Salat. So that's why she has to make up the Fajr that she didn't pray before her bleeding began. As for the end of her bleeding, it ended with enough time to say Allahu Akbar in Fajr time. So that means she's going to have to pray Fajr because of the end of her bleeding. And since there's no salat combinable with Fajr, she will not have to add anything else. So she's going to have to pray the Fajr from the Fajr time that was in when her bleeding began. And she's going to have to pray the Fajr from the time that was in when her bleeding ended a week later. That's 2 Fajrs she's going to have to pray. She will not have to pray anything in between. Okay, the woman, when she's bleeding, She does not make up the salats that she misses while she is having her monthly bleeding. She does not make them up. The only ones she makes up are the ones that these conditions that we're talking about are met. The salat time was in when the bleeding began, and she had enough time to make the salat before the bleeding. That one she still has to pray. Or the salat time was in when her bleeding ended, and there was enough time to say Allahu Akbar, meaning there was enough time for her to start a salat. Well, then in that case, she needs to make up that salat as well as the one before it if they're combined. But anything between those times, she does not need to make up. And the same is true for the person who's insane, male or female. Let's do one last example. Let's say a woman's period began in Asr time. 1 minute into Asr time is when her period began. And let's say her period ended with 1 minute left in Isha time. So her period ended a week later with 1 minute left in Isha time. It started 1 minute into Asr time. It ended with 1 minute left in Isha time. The woman in this case, the salats that she will have to make up will be Isha and Maghrib. When her bleeding began, there was not enough time for her to pray Asr, so she will not have to make that one up. When her period ended, there was enough time for her to say Allahu Akbar before Isha time was over, so she will have to pray Isha. And since Maghrib is combinable with Isha, she'll have to pray that one too. These are the rules. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Inshallah, it's clear to you, and we can continue. With that, we finished talking about what you need to know concerning the salat times. Okay, the time of the salat is the fourth of the 8 conditions of the salat. We already mentioned that Islam is a condition, so the salat is not valid from a kafir. We mentioned that mental discrimination is a condition, so salat is not valid from someone who doesn't know, who doesn't understand what he's saying. The third condition was purification, and we talked extensively about purification already. So salat is not valid from the one who has minor Hadeeth, major Hadeeth, or unexcused najis on their body. Or in the case of unexcused najis, even if it's on their clothes or the ground that they're touching in salat or in something they're carrying. Okay, all of those cases, all of those places and situations, he needs to be clear of all of that. The fourth condition was that the prayer time has already begun. Okay, and we just finished talking about everything you need to know about prayer times. Now we're going to move to the fifth condition of salat, which is covering the awrah. Awrah is an Arabic word, a word that all of us should learn. Awrah is an Arabic word referring to the part of your body that must be covered. Okay, it's often translated as nakedness. Okay, but it doesn't mean you're completely naked. The awrah is just a part of your body. It's the part that needs to be covered up. Okay, and in the salat, every person has a part of their body that must be covered. And if it's not covered, if at any point in the salat, a portion of the awrah is uncovered, then the salat is invalid. Let's read. It says the fifth condition of salat is that one covers one's nakedness, awrah, with something that conceals the color of one's skin and hair from all sides except underneath. Oh boy. Yeah, this one's going to be tough. All right, let's talk about it. So, your responsibility in salat is to cover your awrah with something that covers or conceals the color of your skin as well as the color of your hair. This means that if the only garment you're wearing in salat is something sheer, something that you can see through, then you do not have your awrah covered and your salat is not valid. Okay? If you are wearing a dress made out of saran wrap, this will not count as you covering your aura. Even if you do have something wrapped around your body, it's not concealing the color of your skin nor the color of your hair. And so it doesn't count as a cover for purposes of covering the aura. Okay. This also means that if the garment that you're wearing has like big spaces between the fibers, okay, some clothes, clothing is made of fibers, little strings of thread. Those fibers are interwoven into like a net. Okay. If you look carefully between those fibers, there's little holes. There's little holes. Okay. The little holes between the fibers, they don't matter. Okay. They don't matter. What matters here is what we call normal conversation distance. Okay. If a person who is normal conversation distance away, if he cannot see the color of your skin or the color of your hair beneath that garment, then we say that garment is covering you. The very small holes that you got to look super close in order to notice, they don't count. Don't even worry about those. But if you're wearing very old clothes can sometimes become threadbare, where you can see the individual threads and you can see the spaces between them. Even if you're at a normal conversation distance, at that point, the person will actually be able to see what color your skin is through the garment. Okay, in that case, at that point, we would say that you're not covering your aura. Why? Because a person normal conversation distance away can see the color of the skin. Okay. Let's read what the aura actually is. There's 3 different cases. Case number 1, talking about men, males, whether they're men or boys. We're talking about males here. For males, the aura is everything between the navel and the knee. Okay, so for males, their aura in salat is everything between the navel and the knee. I'm going to say it again. It's everything what? Between the navel and the knee. So what you should understand from that is that the navel itself, meaning the belly button, the navel itself is not part of the aura. And the knee itself is not part of the aura. You do not have to cover your navel in salat, and you do not have to cover your knee in salat. However, you must cover at least part of your navel and at least part of your knee in order to make sure that you have covered everything that's between them. Because the aura includes everything between the navel and the knee. So yes, you will have to cover at least part of the navel and at least part of the knee in order to cover everything that needs to be covered. But know that the knee itself is not part of the aura, nor is the navel. So brothers, you need to be extra careful if you are, for example, wearing a pair of jeans and a t-shirt and you're making salat. Because what often happens is when you're standing up straight, that t-shirt and the jeans are covering what needs to be covered. But then when you bend over in ruku', the t-shirt comes out of your pants, rises up a little bit, and what happens is the lower part of your back becomes exposed. Sometimes even a little bit of the butt crack even sometimes get exposed. In this case, your salat is now ruined. Your salat is invalid, broken. It won't count. Okay, so my advice to those of you who pray wearing t-shirts and polo shirts and things of that sort is for you to either tuck it in, and, tighten the belt or whatever to make sure it doesn't come out. Or you could wear an undershirt and tuck in the undershirt. And that way you can leave the outer shirt flowing loose. But as long as that undershirt doesn't come out, then you're fine. Also, since we're talking about shirts, we haven't made it to the sisters yet. But since we're on the subject of shirts, also be careful of shirts that are very loose. Okay, in a lot of places, Muslim women, they wear clothing that's very, very loose. And of course, it's good for women to wear clothing that's loose. Okay, but in some places, like in some parts of Africa, their shirt is so loose that when the woman goes into the ruku'ah, the shirt falls away from her body, and the shirt is just hanging like 2 whole feet below her stomach, and it, just exposing everything between her body and her shirt. It can all be seen by anybody who's standing behind her. In this case, yes, it's good to wear baggy clothes, but in this case, the woman is not adequately covering her aura, because when she's in the ruku' position, her aura is exposed from a direction that's not underneath. That's from a direction of behind. Okay, so you don't want to fall into that trap either. Let's read more about the women. Second bullet, it says, for female slaves, the aura in salat is everything between the navel and the knee. Okay. So if a woman is an actual slave, like she's property, she's owned by someone else. All right. If a woman is a slave girl, she's owned by another human being. She's considered to be property. This female slave, her aura in salat is the same as the aura of a man, meaning that what she needs to cover in salat is just what's between her navel and her knee. Okay, this is her aura where? In salat. This does not mean that outside of salat she can walk around covering only what's between her navel and her knee. Okay, that it doesn't mean that, but it means that in the salat, as long as what's between her navel and knee is covered from all directions except from underneath, then she has met this particular condition of covering her aura in the salat. That's what it means. Third case, for free females. Okay, now we're going to talk about the woman who is not a slave. She's not property. She's free. And inshallah, that'll be all of us. All of those sisters here. But for the free woman, it says the aura is her entire body, except for her face and hands. So for the free woman, the part of her body that she must cover in the salat is her entire body, except that she's allowed to show her face and her hands. Now, we've already defined what the face is back in the wudu section. It's everything from the normal hairline to the bottom of the chin and everything between the ears. Okay, that is what she's allowed to show in salat. That means the ears themselves cannot show because they're not part of the face. That means that this part underneath your mouth, this part like under your jaw, this part is not part of the face. It needs to be covered. Okay, it needs to be covered in salat for the salat to be valid. As for the hands, the part that can show is everything below the wrist. So from the wrist, which is here, I don't know if you can see that, from the wrist to the tips of the fingers, from here down to here, can show. Everything above the wrist must be covered. It must be covered with something that, again, that conceals the color of the skin and the color of the hair. All right, this means that her whole neck must be covered. It means her ears must be covered in the salat and also outside of the salat. Okay, the woman, when she's in public or around men that are not mahrams for her, her aura is the same as this aura, which is to say she must cover her whole body except for her face and her hands. Now, sister, can you put the screen share back up? Yeah. Let me just draw something on here so I can explain something that a lot of people don't understand. I don't know how to draw this. I'll just draw it the hard way. I'm trying to draw a pair of pants, just so you know. All right. Pretend this looks like a pair of pants. Okay. And while we're at it, let's pretend that there's some feet sticking out here. And there's some feet sticking out. Right. Okay. Pretend this is a woman wearing some pants, wearing some blue socks. Okay. There are many people who believe that in this situation, the woman is covering her aura because her pants are covering her leg and her socks are covering what's below the leg, what's below the pants legs. This is not the case. Okay, this type of covering is sufficient when you're out in public walking down the sidewalk or something, but this type of covering is not sufficient in the Salah. Why is that? Why is it that it's not sufficient in the Salat? It's because the rule says that your aura must be covered from all directions except from underneath. And what's meant by underneath is underneath the aura itself. Underneath the aura itself. So the woman's aura stretches all the way to the bottom of her feet. The bottom of her feet is where her aura reaches. So as long as the opening of her clothes is beneath the bottom of her feet, then that opening is okay. It's excused. Like, you're not held accountable for opening that's below the bottom of your feet. But if you have an opening in your clothing, which is above the bottom of your feet, then that opening in the clothing is something that you're going to be held accountable for. So if a woman is in this situation where she's wearing pants and she's wearing socks, the easy thing to do is to tuck your pants leg into the sock, just so that this hole, which is here between your leg and the edge of the pants, so that opening will not be there. Tuck your pants leg into your sock, and then you can pray, and you'll be fine. Another thing that a lot of people do, I mean, in some of the countries that I used to go to in the masajid, they would have like a basket there in the masjid, and inside the basket, they would have some things called tenoras. A tenora is like a little wraparound thing that the woman can put around her legs while she prays. It's not very big. You wouldn't wrap it around your waist. You would wrap it just below the knee, like right here. You'd wrap it around your feet, around your pants, just below the knee, and it's long enough that it'll reach to the ground. And some women would wrap that around, and then they'd make their salat, and then after they were done, they would return the tenora to the basket. These are the sorts of things that people do overseas to make sure that the woman's salat, if she prays in the masjid, to make sure that it is that it's valid, that it meets the conditions. This one is probably the biggest one that I think a lot of people don't take into account, is that this opening of the pants leg it harms the Muslim woman in Salat because the opening is not below her awrah, it's above. It's above the bottom of her awrah, which means technically this opening is beside her awrah rather than beneath it. I'd say that's probably the case that I need to warn about the most right there. Another case is the hijab. I recommend that a woman who wears a hijab, that she tuck it in, like tuck it into your shirt when you make the salat. Again, it's okay if it comes out of the shirt in your regular life, but during the salat, have it tucked in so that there's no opening here. Shirts, if the woman's wearing like pants and a shirt, then for sure tuck that shirt in. But the easiest thing to do is just bring a prayer garment with you. If you have a backpack or something, just leave it in the backpack. Whenever the salat time comes, just put it on. Let it be a one-piece garment that goes from the top of your head all the way down to the ground. It's called a jilbab. If you have a jilbab, then you don't have anything to worry about. Right now, that's all I can think of off the top of my head of the sorts of things that I see frequently that pertain to covering the awrah that I want to make sure to call everyone's attention to. So let's stop there, inshallah. If anyone has any questions about covering the awrah or questions about salat preventers, what to do when they start, when they end, then please feel free to ask. Excellent. I've stunned you. So, alhamdulillah. Okay, if there's no questions, and I'm just going to assume that everything is clear. And then I'll just wait to see you next week, inshallah. Let's say La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. بارك الله فيكم. I'll see you next week at the same time, inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.